But welcome to the Chap Therapy Collective podcast, Discover Here, Grow. I'm here with Walter Sorrells, who's a sword and knife maker, forge master in Atlanta, and we're excited to get into learning about some of his art. We tried to connect for a while, but I finally tracked you down, and one of us will die with honor, today. So I've heard that you're a good teacher. I would like a lesson, is what I have heard you're supposed to say when you go into the opposing dojo and you're challenging the master of the. So, can you tell us a little bit about your work? You're in Atlanta, and you're a blacksmith and you I don't want to say forger, because then maybe the IRS will come after you. But what do you call yourself? Do you still go by blacksmith, or?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I do a lot less blacksmithing than I used to. When I got started, I was making Japanese swords pretty much exclusively. And, just over time, I kind of evolved into making more modern knives and kind of production type knives, semi-production knives. And actually, these days, I'm making a lot of tools. I make tools for Japanese sword making and just general knife making. So
yeah, I've seen your work. That was what led me to reach out, and then I couldn't believe you're so close. I think I saw like a Japanese sword that had a burl saya, which is, carving burl is hard enough. I can't imagine having to be able to keep it, pretty, and also get it right. So, you're quite a craftsman. Are most of those pieces kind of commission, or do you make a lot and take them to specialty markets, or how does that work?
So when I got started, it was all commission, Japanese sword stuff. So people would say, I want a sword yay long, and, specify all kinds of stuff about it. And that is just a giant pain in the neck. So over time, I've kind of evolved away from doing custom work. It's one of those things that you learn a lot from doing custom work, but at the same time, it's just if this is your income, if you're doing it for fun, it's one thing. But if it's your income source, you're always dependent on whether somebody likes it, whether it was the thing, there are a lot of people who buy stuff just generally, and they feel like, if I just buy this thing, my life is going to be so much better. And especially people who kind of nerd out on a particular sort of thing, and they're spending a bunch of money on it and all that sort of thing. They have all these expectations, and you just never know. Sometimes it's a train wreck, and it's usually not anything you did. It's just that, they had expectations that don't align with whatever you actually produced. And
you get people that want custom art, but they don't trust the artist to, kind of put themselves into something, or
that's kind of true. And so, the perfect kind of client for me is somebody who says, I want it, a 26-inch long blade with such and such geometry. You go and just do it however you want. And those guys are a joy to work for. And that's about half the customers. And the other set are crazy people, and they're very hard to work with.
Yeah, I can imagine. It would be like, what is it? One of my friends, Todd Johnson, does these like custom pipes, but they're like, hundreds of, they're like, some of them will be like pushing $10,000, for a pipe, because they're more like art pieces.
Right.
And he was talking about the presentation of it, that a lot of people go in and they're like great carpenters, but they talk about the pipes that they make or something. And he was just like, I had the language of fine arts, and I went into this, and I talk about pieces that I place in a collection. And that, a lot of that is kind of the difference, where you just got to tell the market what you are. And in a certain way, you tell the market to screw off, a certain segment.
Right.
It's like, but I want buffalo horn on it, and I want it to look like an anime, and I want it to be able to,
Right.
It's like,
well, and you do learn after a certain point to say no. but when I first got started, I mean, there were sort of two factors that coincided to get me into some trouble at the beginning. The first was really just not knowing what I was doing. I mean, from a commercial perspective, I'd been a writer for a long time. That was really my real profession until I got.
What did you write?
I was a novelist, so I wrote mystery novels.
Cool, like kind of film noir, hard boiled, or more true crime, or what was the?
Man, I've written everything. I started doing legal thrillers. This would have been back around 1990, I guess. No, is that? Well, anyway, whenever it was a long time ago. And I sort of evolved out of that, and I had different pseudonyms, and I ghost wrote things, and I wrote. I mean, just endless stuff. I mean, and this sort of dovetails with the second part of the issue for me. The first was I didn't really know how long it would take to make some of these swords and things like that, and so I kind of committed myself to some things that were that I underpriced, and I just didn't realize how long it was going to take to deliver them. The other thing, though, was, when I got started doing this, I was just in a financially precarious position, and I just needed the money. And so I said yes to some things that, in retrospect, were a mistake. But
what got you into Japanese swords and katanas the way that, I mean, because there's a lot to that process. It's not like, usually that's not what people start with,
Well, I was a Japanese martial arts nut for a long time. I did karate for about 20 years. I did a Japanese sword art called Shinkendo, probably for a little under a decade. And I did various other things, Brazilian jiu-jitsu and stuff. And so anyway, actually, I mean, specifically what happened was I was going to write this book that was going to have a main character who was a swordsmith. And, so I said, well, I mean, I always like as a writer to get my hands around stuff, I want to go to the neighborhood where the thing happens, I want to meet the guy who does the thing, And so in this particular case, I was like, well, let me just screw around a little bit and figure out how it works physically, like what it feels like in your hand to do this stuff. And I really just farted around, and I mean, I got the bug like that. It just hit me like a hammer. So I really went probably 15 years where in essence I was doing 2 full-time jobs. So I would write at the beginning of the day, and then I'd start doing sword making in the afternoon, and sometimes that would run up until midnight or something, and it was just 7 days a week of work. And after a while I finally was like, I just got to do one of these things. so I've been doing this full time for a decade or so.
Yeah, I haven't written published fiction for a while, but I used to a little bit, short form stuff. And I would notice that a lot of what I was trying to write about, I was kind of trying to chew on something, and it ended up becoming, even though it's fiction, like it ended up kind of becoming something that I was working on artistically or personally. And the characters that I was kind of being, what if a guy did this? And I would go learn about that. So I know what I'm talking about.
Right.
It end up being something that I just kind of wanted to do, but on some level it wasn't, didn't see myself as, but could see a character as. And then I don't know. Can you say anything about that, or was that a similar thing?
I don't know. It depended on the book that I was working on, honestly, because sometimes, I would be doing something on a deadline, and it was really just mash that stuff out, and whatever it took to get it done was what it took. And honestly, when I first got started, though,
you don't love everything you have to write as a professional writer,
right? No doubt.
Even in some parts of the same book that you do like to write, are not the part you want to write.
Right. But I also when I first got started, I do a lot of research. I mean, I got a job selling cars one time for a book that I was working on. And I did a lot of crime fiction, so I was always interviewing district attorneys and cops and guys like that. And so that stuff is always really useful, but sometimes it can lead you to, oh, I learned all this cool stuff, so let me jam it into the story. So
Yeah.
it sometimes you can overdo it.
Yeah, you can definitely spot, especially with like crime fiction, over-researched work, where somebody's going on about DNA analysis and electrophoresis gel, and it's like, well, I'm glad you think that's cool, but I don't know that we need to.
Right.
There's, when your work with martial arts, was there anything that kind of helped you grow personally, or called you to it from like a history of you working through something? Myself, I just started, so I'm a baby, still with the wooden sword, but. And then James Waits at our practice, we both do Shinkindo, and I'd wanted to do like a historical martial arts that was actually effective for a long time. Like a lot of times with just Kendo or fencing or some schools of stuff, they turn it more into a sport where you're kind of like doing things that wouldn't actually work if you were in a fight, but you get a point for it or something. And so I always wanted to do something that was like, really effective, and Shinkindo was. And I was working through some things. I had kind of had a point where something happened, and I realized like I need to learn to be more assertive, and I need to really deal with some of the stuff that I'm running away from. And just things like as simple as like having to keep your weight forward, it really like challenges my posture. I feel all this stuff kind of come up from childhood where I don't feel like it's safe to be assertive. And I mean, it psychologically is hard and draining, which is, I want to do something hard that makes me grow at this point in my life, which is kind of why I'm doing it. What was your relationship to kind of martial arts and stuff before you got into that brought you to the sword making?
Well, I think that a lot of martial arts people are, kind of nerds who are compensating for,
Yeah, guilty.
Their childhood, but also my sister's ex-husband, who actually just died last night.
Sorry to hear that.
Well, yeah, it's a sad thing. Anyway, he once said to me, I'm a nerd athlete, and I had this weird sense of recognition. Like at age 40, I realized, oh yeah, you're exactly right, Joe. I'm a nerd athlete too. I'd always loved athletics and was a, pretty athletic person, but I never conceived myself as a jock. I was always the nerdy, brainy kind of guy. And so, I felt like martial arts is a really natural avenue for people with that kind of psychology, I think. But beyond that, I think everybody goes into martial arts and learns something different. I mean, I've known people who said I was out of control, and this helped me, control my aggressions. I've known people who said I was too timid, and this learned to make me more confident and aggressive. And so, I think everybody has to find their path inside of a martial art. And that's really part of your job as a martial artist. It's not just kicking and punching or whatever. It's turning your eyes towards yourself and trying to figure out, okay, who is this guy that's doing this thing, and what will then make him more effective,
Killing the opponent on the inside, kind of embracing the shadow and all that Jungian and Joseph Campbell stuff is definitely relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, a Japanese sword is not an easy thing to jump into making. I mean, you've got multiple types of metal, you've got clay tempering, you've got, really specific tolerances. I mean, you can kind of bring out a European broadsword that's serviceable, but that's a complicated thing. Can you say anything about kind of that process? And
yeah, I mean, I am, part of my nerd quality is that I just love learning things, and I'm very focused and very, when I dive into something, I really hit it hard. And so I just immersed myself in it. And of course, I'd been using Japanese swords for a while, and, I had some concept of what this tool was supposed to do. And that really, I think, helped me frame how I went about it. And maybe it's a little pretentious to say it increased the seriousness of what I was doing, but I did want to, like, there are a lot of people who make Japanese kind of styled, sharp, pointy things who don't really work too hard to get the historical details right and that sort of thing. Yeah. And that was something that was very interesting to me, and it was important to me in terms of what I was trying to do. And so, I never went to Japan. I was never apprenticed or anything like that. But I mean, I read every book in the English language about Japanese swords. I talked to people. Of course, I did train too. And so, I just kind of triangulated and tried to cram as much information as I could into that experience so that what I was making, fit into my idea of this sword.
Mhm.
Now, I would also say I was never trying to be like a Japanese sword maker. Everybody who's
Hattori Hanzo or something.
Right. I mean, everybody who's in martial arts for a while will meet some people who try to become Japanese, sort of. They imagine themselves to become. I was never into that, and so I always felt. I mean, it's partly kind of an uncomfortable thing, and probably in certain respects, it's why I've stepped back a little bit from Japanese sword making, because I just felt like after a certain point, there's a limit to where I can go with it. But I always felt like, hey, I'm an American guy making this stuff. I was never trying to project myself into some mythical Japanese world or something. And so, basically, I
it can get
went out there
uncomfortable
and
when you
tried
look at some people, like, it gets uncomfortable the way they mythologize the self and like pretend they're part of some lineage where it's like, oh, okay,
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I just really immersed myself in it and tried to learn as much as I could. And a lot of it's just trial and error. And, I think a lot of people feel like they need to have somebody teach them to do X or Y or Z. And I've always been a little bit of an anti-authoritarian, do-it-myself guy to a fault, and there are advantages to having that kind of character, and there's some very severe disadvantages to it. And sometimes, I have to fail 12 times when I could have just failed 3 times if I just asked somebody, but I just don't a lot of
I had a conversation with my wife last night about her daughter who's 7, and she's and we were telling her, you can just do things in this order and this is how it works. And she was really trying to break the whole system and reinvent the wheel and find out a new way to do it and kind of getting in trouble. And I was like, no, look, you can do it this way, and this is what everyone's done, or you can do what you're doing, but you're probably going to be here for 3 hours doing this chore that you don't want to do. And that's fine. And, Emily's like, what are you doing? And I was like, I'm not telling her to go either way, because I see myself, but that left-hand path, I just want her to know that this is a harder way to do it, and really pick when you do that, because I'm an intuitive learner. I'm an experiential learner. When somebody tries to say, here's the way that it has to be done, I'm like, what if I skip step 3 and do 8? And what if I do? And I want to fail a lot of times to prove to myself. But it's a harder way to be. But ultimately, I think you learn more. You discover stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there are pluses and minuses to everything that way. And I circling back to the martial arts thing, one of the things that I feel like I learned the most from martial arts was how to learn how to do stuff. A lot of the things that I learned to do early in my life, I learned, frankly, in a half-ass way, because I was such a cussed individualist about it, and having somebody say, okay, this is the sequence of stuff you have to learn, and you just have to do it this way, and don't ask any questions, or at least, you can ask questions, but the answer is always going to be the same thing, That actually has helped me learn other things subsequently a lot faster, because I spend a little bit less time screwing around, whereas sort of my MO when I was a kid for learning something was kind of undirected. It was sort of like, hey, here's a bunch of stuff, let me try and make this thing or do this thing. But I didn't have a real rigorous, practiced, sequential way of getting through something. And actually, a lot of times it's a lot faster to do it that way.
Well, I mean, can you talk about the process of making a sword? I mean, we did an episode on katanas and talked about it a little bit, but it's like, you're clay tempering to bend these things. They're different on the spine than they are on the edge, is part of one of the important properties. And then a lot of people, fold multiple kinds of metal or have, different, or there kinds of like, because Japanese swords, to me, it's this kind of fusion that I like, because I like beauty and I like art. But I also like functionality. That's what draws me to things like architecture, where it's like, there's a lot of modern architecture that I feel like just doesn't work, and people are like, oh, it's pretty. And it's like, when I love metallurgy, and I know a lot of, I'm not talking to a blacksmith, but I'm kind of a metallurgy nerd, but I also, like beauty. And so it's like, when I go to the fair and, my wife will be like, oh, this is pretty. You like knives? Don't you want one of these? And it's like, when I see that someone's taken like a railroad tie and forged it into a knife, I'm just like, this is a tool steel. Like, it's not like this is made to bend and be flexible. This is not, it doesn't matter that it's pretty. This is not how you make this. And there's a Japanese sword that is kind of building, form and beauty together in a way that is very hard.
Yeah, I mean, it is a classic form follows function kind of thing. Well, so anyway, I'll just talk briefly about the process of making a Japanese sword. So traditionally, the starting point is the steel, and so steel in Japan was directly smelted, which, not to be too nerdy about it, was unusual in terms of the metallurgy of steel and iron in history. But basically, you had a big bin of charcoal and iron ore, and you set it on fire and you just burn it for a long time. And by doing it in a very, very precise way, what you end up with in the bottom is steel, and looks like a moon rock. It doesn't look at all like anything you could make a sword out of. And so you have to then refine that. And so there were many, many different techniques in Japan, but they all basically involved taking, busting up this chunk of steel, smashing it, layering it, and then heating it so hot that all those layers would stick together. So then you would draw that out, fold it over, and do it again. And you just had to do this over and over because there was so much crud in the steel, and the carbon content was heterogeneous, and there were all these different factors that made it necessary to repeat this many times. And that process yielded a steel that was beautiful. It was just visually interesting, especially if you polish, it in a certain way. And so that's the most traditional starting point for a Japanese sword. Now, today we can go down to, steel store and buy steel and just make it from there. And we don't have to go through that initial folding step. I like doing that step, but it's incredibly time consuming. And so it's very difficult to price a sword high enough to account for the outlandish amount of labor that's involved.
And you're looking at $7,000 or $8,000 or more, when somebody's really done kind of iron sand technique and pounded.
Oh, I mean, I completely would lose money if I did $7,000 for a sword. $20,000, I might feel like I wasn't ripping myself off. And so anyway, I don't typically do that, but you can also take modern steels and fold them over. This is basically what you would call Damascus steel, but you can approximate. It's not going to look exactly like a traditional Japanese sword, but you can kind of approximate it far less effort. So anyway, that's one starting point, is just, here's a chunk of steel. Now, what am I going to do with it? So the next phase is you got to forge that into the shape of a sword. And a lot of people think that this is the hard part, and it's not easy. It's not a lay down to forge it. Oh, man.
All right.
Yeah, there was a very close lightning strike.
I saw a flash. I thought maybe a bulb blew or something.
No, it was a lightning strike.
You've angered the gods.
Apparently so. Apparently so. Anyway, once you forge it, then you have to actually grind it to shape. And traditionally, they ground it by hand on brick-shaped little, abrasive stones. And that process also extremely, extremely slow. So, what I would typically do is do most of the work. In most, meaning most of the stock removal, most of the removal of the metal with modern tools, belt grinders. But at a certain point, the geometry is so unforgiving that you really, I personally like doing those final stages on these traditional Japanese water stones, just ridiculously time consuming. So you're spending, if you do it the most traditional way, you're spending all this time at the beginning, and then you're spending a lot of time at the end too. Anyway, once you've polished it to a particular shape, then it's time to heat treat it to harden it. Up to this point, it's not a sword, it's just a sword shaped object. And so at this point, you heat it up to roughly 1500 degrees. Well, you've covered part of it with clay, and that clay, I won't get into too much of the,
you're changing stuff here to make sure that the spine is softer. We like the nerdy stuff. Then the blade has to be very, very hard, but that makes it more brittle, so it could snap if you made the whole sword that. And
that's really the primary innovation of the Japanese smiths, was that we call it differential hardening today, but the term for what happens is you get something you can actually see. It's a visual marker of this distinction between the hard edge and the soft spine. And so the soft spine gives it the shock resistance, and the hard edge gives it edge holding and, ability to cut hard stuff. So, to accomplish that, you have to cover the spine with clay that acts as sort of a heat sink or an insulator. And then you heat the whole thing up to about 1500 degrees, and you plunge it into water. And in about 3 seconds, the edge will convert from a soft steel to a hard steel. And that hard stuff we call martensite today. But when you look at a Japanese sword, that martensite edge and pearlitic spine is actually visually distinct. And so there's this little wavy line called the hamon that runs down the blade. And that's an artistic feature of Japanese swords, and different sword schools do them different ways, and you can tell a lot about where the sword was made and who it was made by and when it was made and all that sort of thing by how the hamon is shaped. And
as they get better at it in the record, as they get better at the process, which it's amazing that they figured that. Now we know about the crystal property of metals, and we can model these things, in computer simulation of what it's going to do at different temperatures. It's like they had no idea. This was trial and error, which is pretty amazing, to generationally pass down that knowledge.
The flip side of that, though, is that you have generations to get it right.
Well, you see, as the record goes forward, they stop finding bent swords and they start finding broken swords, and then they start making the perfect sword. So there's a point where they go too far in the direction of making them brittle, and then find this happy medium. Which it and just like because there's kind of a lot of BS about like the history of katanas that they're magical, or the folding them a million times makes metal better or something, or it's like so much of that was the limitations that Japan didn't have iron, that they didn't have they didn't have wood steel like the Arabs, they didn't have like the ability of the German smiths to just kind of make these weapons this way, but in those limitations, they found a process that ultimately made kind of a better product. But yeah, it does take 200 years, which, I guess sucks. I don't know.
Well, we're talking about art here as well as more practical things. And this is actually something that I sort of had a revelation about when I was a writer. And I would say it informed my knife making too, and sword making. I really came to believe that genre was critical to writing. That having some kind of clear idea of a certain, it's really like almost like Campbell or whoever, an archetypical type story that you can hang things on. I mean, these are primitive parts of our psychology: the need for love, the need for justice or vengeance. These kinds of things have genres that match them. And the point being that when I was first trying to learn how to be an artist, I was trying to just be out there and just go in all directions and do everything, and what I found was that the more that I narrowed my focus and the more rigorous I was in the structure of what I did, the more that I was able to get a lot of the noise out of the work, and it just got better as a result. So, I always counsel people to try and close in on your story instead of trying to tell 12 stories at the same time. And the same thing, as a singer or a knife maker or whatever, if you try and do every single thing, under the sun, you're probably not going to do any of them all that well.
Yeah, very few people, I think, can do that. Do you have, just to kind of nerd out about metal, do you have steels that you like? The little katana in my office right up there is 1095 and T1 folded. But I always like my knives are VG1. Like, I'm always interested in what they're doing with powdered metallurgy. And every year it seems like the stuff gets better. They figure out some new thing.
Oh yeah.
Do you play around with any super steels or anything weird, or you just kind of
for Japanese stuff, W2 is the steel that I like best. It's basically 1095 with a little vanadium in it.
Yeah. How does that change it?
It decreases grain size, and it makes you get vanadium carbides, which are harder than
the martensite is like a little bit more sharp.
It's just harder and more resistant to edge deformation. But it was typically a little bit more carefully smelted or produced, and it always has a low level of manganese, and that's really, really important in producing hamones. If you have a bunch of manganese, forget hamones, you're not going to get them. So
I like to sharpen mine. Like, I've got a giant like a grinder, and I'll have a leather stroke that I'd add stuff to it. And I like that T1, you can get it a little hotter and go a little faster without ruining your temper, because a lot of these swords, you can pay a ton for them and then get it hot on a grinder and completely ruin.
Oh yeah. As far as the super steels go, all my production stuff is stainless steel, and so I'm using S30V and those kinds of steels, and I'm not trying to do anything super crazy with the production stuff. I make those on a CNC machine, and I heat treat them in batches, and I want something that's predictable and good, but I'm not aiming for, you know, the top of the mountain in terms of performance or something.
Some of that stuff is so insane to work. I mean, it's like you need a team of people to I mean, it's like maybe you can get it, you know, what is it, like Z-Max or something? There's like somewhere you look at the chart and it's like, well, that's cool that you can get it up there, but like, how do you make that, you know?
Right. Right. I mean, honestly, S30V is kind of my go-to for my production stuff, because to me, it's kind of a sweet spot of performance and edge holding, but still, it's not crazy to work with. It's not crazy to heat treat. It doesn't have any weird qualities. I mean, like some of these super steels, you have to go through some very odd heat treating,
dry ice and oil and
just all kinds of stuff. So to me, that's a good, you know, kind of high end, middle of the road type steel.
What kind of stuff are you making now? Like knives, and I saw you make a lot of tools for making hamon making, you know, carving tools for the woodworking that goes along with sword making.
Yeah, so I mean, this gives you an example. I mean, it looks like a brick, right? It says, let me see if that, can you actually read that?
Sorrells brick, yeah.
Sorrells brick, yeah. So all this is a grinding jig. It just holds your blade at a certain angle, and allows you to grind the bevels on your knives. And so, you know, I manufacture that. I make that on a CNC machine. All this stuff I use a CNC machine, all the, you know, all these modern tools. Though I will say the chisels, I'm looking around to see if I have any of them sitting around here, but I don't. The chisels that I make for scabbards, saya chisels, are called sayanomi in Japanese, but they're scabbard chisels. Those are all hand forged. But you know, most of these things that I make, like this little brick right here, I make on a CNC machine. And for those who are not familiar with what a CNC machine is, it is a mill that is computer controlled. And you know, I started doing that about probably close to 10 years ago. And you know, I didn't know squat about it. I mean, I just started fooling, you know, I plunked down a bunch of money with having faith that I would be able to figure out what the hell I was doing. And over time I did. And you know, it's basically like if you imagine a drill press that spins around and has a tool that drills a hole, a mill can do that, but can also go sideways. And so once you can control that with a computer, then you can do circles and figure eights and all kinds of crazy things. And you can basically machine, you know, you can take a big block of something and cut away everything that's not an elephant or whatever. And you can just make virtually anything you want on a CNC machine. It's just, they're wonderful machines, and I've gotten really absorbed in that in recent years. And it's, to me, I mean, I sort of have an engineer hiding in my brain, and it's a really great combination of artistic and highly technical work. I find it super fun, really, really fascinating.
Yeah, that's kind of, I mean, when I'm working on something, I want to play with a technical aspect and I also want to play with an aesthetic aspect. And I kind of get bored if it's just math or if it's just
right,
just kind of scribbling and saying I'm expressing myself. You know, I kind of want there to be some. So I don't know. It's a frustrating dragon to ride, that one, but it takes you some interesting places.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing, you know, since a Suba, just the you know, hilt of a sword on your side is, you know, $600 to $800, that it's probably not something that I can afford. But if somebody was to just buy like a kendo sword from you that they wanted to do, you know, the cutting of the mats or something, you know, what would something like that run? You know,
These days about 10 grand. You know, it's just it's all 100% custom. I mean, I say custom, but I mean it's handmade. You know, there's no shrink wrapped stuff that I would do. I would make all the fittings. I would wrap the handle myself. I'd lacquer it. You know, and so all these different little sub crafts that are put together to do this. And there's the blade itself, which is the most complicated and expensive part of the whole thing, and the most unforgiving, you know. And so it's months of work to make a sword for me.
Well, so artistically, what are you chewing on now? Like, what's the modern kind of practice look like? What excites you about what you're doing? I saw that there was a lot of the kind of like copper folding. What's the word for that?
Mokame.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on my. It's a long day. Yeah, but it looks like that was kind of the feature now, that in the side tools when looking at your site, or anything new that's coming out that you're kind of working on or chewing on artistically.
I mean, honestly, the stuff that I'm really focused on most is the tools right now. You know, I design a new knife periodically, and I'll make a Japanese blade, you know, every, you know, few months. Usually these days I'm just making tantos. I mean, honestly, I can't tell you the last time I made a katana, several years ago. And you know, I just sort of got so involved in the production stuff and the CNC and all that it just, to juggle really 3 different things. Plus, I mean, you know, I do basically 1 YouTube video a week, and that's 2 days work pretty much. So
are those open, like anyone can watch them, or those things you sell as classes or things?
Oh yeah, that's just stuff on YouTube. I mean, I do have a few things that I sell. That's how I got started with the video stuff. When I first got started, I pretty quickly figured out how to do interesting hamons. And so I used to, this is back in the days before YouTube and Instagram and all that stuff. And so I would post all these, not, you know, every time I'd make a knife, I'd post it on knife forums, and people would always say, "Oh, that's really cool, hamon. How did you do that?" And so I, for probably 2 years, got emails, you know, once a week from somebody saying, "How do you do your hamons?" And I would dutifully write them a whole big ass long, here's how you make a hamon thing. And you know, finally, at a certain point, I was like, you know, I mean, I'm a nice guy and everything, but this is getting ridiculous. You know, I need to do something to shortcut this time drain. And so I thought, oh, I'll get a cheap little video camera. You know, actually, this is when not 4K, but HD cameras had first come in. So this is almost 20 years ago. It is over 20 years ago now. So I got a little HD camera and started doing a video about how to make hamons. And I thought it was going to be, you know, like 10, 15 minutes long, and I'd sell it for $10 to just offset the cost of shipping the thing. And that way I wouldn't have to answer so many emails. And just being the obsessive kind of dude that I am, it ends up being about an hour long, and I spent months doing it and all this stuff. So I was like, oh, I got to charge a little more money for that. And so I did, you know, one about hamons, one about forging Japanese blades. I did one about making sayas. I did one about, you know, heat treating, and something about, anyway, I did a bunch of them. And so that process, you know, of making all those things, 5 or 6 years later, YouTube came out, and I just sort of slid into YouTube, really just trying to hype these. I was just trying to sell the videos, you know. And I mean, the first time I just took, you know, one of my videos and I kind of chopped it up. So I had about 2-minute long video, and you know, I put it on this YouTube thing. I mean, this is this was 15 years ago, early days of YouTube, and I just stuck it on there, and you know, well, let's just see what happens. And you know, nobody really bought my videos as a result of this. And I came back about 3 months later. I was like, well, let's just see if anybody watched it. You know, like 250,000 people had watched the video. I was like, okay, there's something I'm missing here. And I'm not sure what I need to do here, but I know I need to do something. And so I just started posting videos, and I've been doing it for 15 years now. So I've done like 500 videos on YouTube, and that's kind of my marketing thing, I guess. But it's very time consuming. Anybody who's done video, as you know, doing a podcast, you think, oh, I'll just take some pictures.
Color correcting for 40 minutes before you can even start to cut out the silences or something. Yeah.
Right. All that stuff. It's ridiculous. But that's kind of the story of my life, is just doing really labor intensive things that a smart person would hire somebody else to do.
Those are the guests that we look for, because the kind of rugged individualism meets reality, and a lot of times there's the innovation. Do you have any thoughts on kind of like art writing, or your process of how your psychology changes over time, or you kind of work through anything or figure things out about yourself while going through that kind of artistic development and professional development process?
I always tell people that I am the exact same person I was when I was 13 years old. And I really believe that to a large degree this is true. What I feel like my life has been about is not changing who I am in any serious way, but in becoming more effective at making my 13-year-old self move through the world. Yeah. So it's been more instrumental stuff, but I was always just confident and happy in who I was. And, so I've never been somebody who struggled in any deep way. I always struggled with stuff out there, but I never struggled with myself, really. And so, what I've just tried to do is just be a little more effective and a little bit less, accept the things that I suck at, and if I can ameliorate them, that's great, but I'm not going to try and change them, because most of the things that I suck at are not, things that are going to wreck my life. So
yeah, if you're one of my patients that's listening, I swear I didn't set Walter up to say that, but a lot of them have heard me say that, like, in doing this podcast and reading the biographies of artists and psychologists that I think are interesting, that it isn't really discovering or figuring out anything new. It's figuring out how to go back to who you always knew you were, but be less ashamed of that and more effective at that in the world. It's dealing with the world's reaction to you, not really figuring out what you need to do. But you also want to be careful with that, because it's like, talking about Joseph Campbell, as soon as you stop changing on that monomyth, as soon as you stop changing on the hero's journey, what are you? The antagonist. The antagonist is someone that's frozen at some point in development. And so there's always that insecurity of like, have I stopped growing, or am I really going back to what I knew? It's like only intuition kind of shows you those dual perspectives, the truth between things that might look the same, but subjectively, we can tell the difference.
Yeah. I mean, I've always felt like, I'm somebody who just likes challenges. And so, that force, if you always, it's the sort of the shark that has to keep swimming kind of thing. So I always feel like it's not like I have to knock myself out trying to find new things in my life and new challenges. That's what I just swim in. That's my that's just my world. And so there's always something new. There's always something I'm getting excited about. And I have no insight into anything therapeutic in life. But what I would say about my own perspective about myself is, I'm just not all that interested in myself. I'm not that interested in my problems, or I'm not that interested in why I can or can't do this, or what, I just try to focus on things out there, and do things that are interesting to me. And what I have always found, and this is actually something that they talk about in Japanese martial arts and Buddhism and so on, is that if you do a practice, and you just do this thing, and you don't think about why you're doing it or whatever, but you just do it with fullness and seriousness, whatever your personality is will just manifest itself. And you don't have to be, looking inside, navel gazing too much most of the time. If
I
you
feel like
find,
that's the death of art, is over analyzing why you're doing it and who you are and how to do it. You just kind of have to find this flow of being
100%.
you through what you are doing. Which, people will say, but how do you do that?
Right.
Tell me how to do that.
Well, in truth, it's harder than it sounds. It sounds like, oh yeah, just get up and just do it, man.
Yeah.
But it's harder than that. But but everybody wants to generalize from their own psychology to what other people be doing or thinking, But I really do feel that my happiness in life has, to a large degree, come from just looking to the future and trying to find something interesting out there to move toward. And as long as I'm doing that, I'm just happy as a pig in shit. I hope this is not a non-curse.
No, it's not a degraded podcast. Trying to make it a little bit more cool and democratized and approachable, and not like, I'm the psychology knower who is logged on to teach you, but just kind of, you already know how to do this. Just remember, it's kind of the vibe of the podcast. So please, any weird political opinions or blue jokes you want to get off your chest. Well, that's really pretty. I mean, anything else about the kind of nature of your art, or kind of what you see moving into in the future?
So one thing that people underestimate or don't look at with respect to art is, we have this idea about art, many of us, that came out of the sort of romantic period, that art is all about, self-revelation, and
You're talking about like Lord Byron and that kind of
yeah,
romantic,
all that,
movement.
yeah, right. And if you went back another 100 or 200 years, you would find that virtually all artists consider themselves, pretty close to guys that make chairs. You're a craftsman, and that's where you start, is making stuff. And part of making stuff is that you have to find customers who will pay for you to make the stuff again.
Yeah.
And now, look, most people who make art are doing it, for fun or self-fulfillment or whatever. It's a hobby or whatever. But in my case, I've been a working artist since I was, in my 20s, and sometimes that pressure to do stuff for a marketplace can be oppressive, but a lot of times it's kind of clarifying. It gets you away from like, oh, look at me, I'm an artist, look how self-important am I, and you're like, okay, I'm making chairs here, and when you come back to that, it makes making art easier. There's, like, it's easy to be intimidated by art and like, oh, I'll never be Beethoven, but if you think of yourself as a guy who, makes chairs, it's not so intimidating. And again, it gets back to that, martial arts thing of do the thing as sincerely as possible, and you will start to find yourself in that work no matter what.
Well, you're speaking to something that really speaks to me, because, I write a lot about anthropology and stuff. And it's like, like we had to make houses, we had to make swords, we had to make pipes, we had to make chairs. But then in doing that, we kind of had to make them be in conversation with a culture, and we put little things into them that make me different. People didn't have to make them beautiful. They just sort of want to do that. And so it's like, I work with a lot of creatives, and that's what I always tell them is like, I don't know what kind of art I want to make. I don't know, poem, whatever. I'm like, no, just go make a thing, and then the art comes from that, you know. And the artists that I profile and write about, like I love the history of like lounge chairs specifically, right, about the Eames and how they kind of are in conversation, anticipating a future they don't even really live to see. You know, some of Ray Eames's last stuff is almost bumping up against predicting the internet. You know, I feel like some of his hypertext stuff and architecture, you know, also is doing that. If you just kind of draw something weird in AutoCAD and then, you know, Frank Gehry it, it's like it doesn't work. You know, then you got to go back and do exit signs and fire lines and where do you hang the stuff, and then the flow doesn't work. It's not archetypal, you know. Right. And but you're making a pipe, you're making a chair, you're making a sword, you're making a building. You're in conversation with something that people need, what you start with, and then it sort of becomes you. And that's always like the journey that I'm tracking when I biography artists on our podcast or on our blog. So it's such an interesting thing. And, you know, the limitations of Japanese metallurgy are sort of what make it become what it is, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, to me, one of the great things about, you know, any kind of craft, physical craft, is that the materials are the materials. And, you know, you just work with again, those limitations. You know, if you're making something out of bamboo, you're not going to make a skyscraper out of it. You know, if you're making something out of you know, chicken wire, there are limitations to what you can do with chicken wire. And if you really dig into a particular material, it's going to take you someplace. And that discovery, I mean, you know, one of the things that people kind of fetishize in, you know, in our cultures, you know, the transcendent genius who figured out how to do this or that. And so often I think geniuses are people who were just really attentive to something, you know, a material or a process or a requirement that other people had just kind of said, oh, that's never, we can't get over that or whatever. And so they just keep dogging this thing, and materials are one of those things. You can find a new material and just really dig into it and play with it and screw around with it and hold it up to the light and feel it, you know, and it just starts getting into your bones. And that process in making stuff is really satisfying to me.
Well, cool. Yeah, that's really beautiful. I appreciate your time and reflection there.
Well, thank you.
Anything else you want to add? And what can I point people to in the show notes? Your website and then YouTube channel? And
yeah, sure. So just, you know, Walter Sorrells Blades is my Japanese sword site. And if you go to YouTube and say Walter Sorrells swords or blades or anything like that, it'll take you to my YouTube channel. I mean, you know, I got Instagram and all that stuff too, but YouTube's really kind of my main platform there. And then I've got a website called Tactix Armory, Tactix with an X, Tactix Armory, which is my production stuff. And then I actually just like 3 days ago made Sorrells Tool, which is my new website, sorrellstool.com.
Cool. Well, I'm happy to link in the show notes of the podcast and the video on YouTube to all those things, so people can just click them below.
Cool.
And anything else you want to add, or
no, this has been a really fun conversation. So I appreciate your having me, and best of luck with the podcast. This is really fun.
Yeah, it's just kind of a labor of love. I don't know that we'll ever be beating Joe Rogan, but you know, it's
who will?
Yeah, yeah. Well, Joe Rogan might be beating Joe Rogan one day. We'll see.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.